All right, we hope you all came up with productive ideas and solutions to all of the world's problems just in the last hour, hour and a half or so. We're expecting a report for you. I'm really pleased to welcome this afternoon's panel, which I think is probably one of the most, we're going to be addressing one of the most hot button topics out there, and that is the issue of when technology collides with citizenship. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of these are obviously great inventions, but as we have seen, they also can be a double-edged sword. Since this gathering last year, there's been an explosion of disturbing revelations that you all have followed, I'm sure very closely, about how social media can be used as a tool for amplifying political manipulation, for acting as a multiplier in the spread of violence, as well as blurring the lines between facts and so-called fake news. The platforms, as well as regulators around the world, have been trying to come up with solutions to these problems. And so what we want to do today is not necessarily focus on the evil that is perpetrated sometimes on social platforms, because we know all too well, whether it be Russian political interference in elections or groups spreading violence in Sri Lanka. What we want to do is focus on the solutions that have been presented to these issues, and really, how effective are they, or is that monster too big to cage? And Richard, I said I wasn't going to try to put the spotlight on you, but actually, since you are from Facebook, let me do that. You all have, Mark Zuckerberg has testified to Congress recently. You all have come forward and said that you advocate that platforms should have an important role to play as regulators. But why should anybody trust a company like Facebook to self-regulate?
So I think actually we're moving beyond the idea of simple self-regulation. I mean, you mentioned this idea of the double-edged sword, which I think is a appropriate way to think of things, that when we built social media, the kind of platforms that we and others build, what they essentially do is dramatically lower the cost of entry for anybody who wants to become media. And so anybody sitting in the audience today with a smartphone could decide that they are now the TV station Athens Today, and they can go out and they can film stuff and broadcast it live to the world over our service, essentially at no cost to themselves, to a global audience. Now, that's dramatic. I'm not saying the quality of Athens Today, if you did it, would necessarily be good enough, but you have the ability to do that. And what we'd see, and again, would remind people, is that people have used that lower barrier to entry to create some amazing things. And if we think back over the last few years, there were moments like the Arab Spring when I think a lot of people were celebrating the political convening power of technologies like ours. They brought people together to assert themselves against repressive regimes. We're now seeing the other side of it, which is people who, I guess people in this room would feel much more concerned about using exactly the same technology, using the low barrier of entry to come at us. The question now is, how do we deal with that? And we think it's a combination of ourselves and governments. So we have the technical means to deal with it. Governments typically don't. Their regulation just deals with small numbers of entities that don't move very much, and we can deal with large numbers of entities that move very quickly. But the goals for that regulation should be set by government, and there should be a framework in which we're accountable and responsible to government for the way in which we do that.
And Damian, as the British MP, you're the chair of the parliamentary committee that seeks to secure British elections from cyber threats. I mean, what is, you all, obviously have this Brexit vote. If you all were to have a Brexit vote again, what would you expect how would you expect Facebook to act to prevent, the possibility of the spread of fake news and manipulation? And what regulations are you all looking at yourselves to deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, it would apply not only to a referendum, but to any election. And what we've seen in the last year is concerns about different elections, different countries in the world, with the common threat, which is how relatively easy it is for an organization, or indeed even a Russian agency, to game social media to manipulate what people see and to promote their favoured content and try and influence the outcome of elections as a consequence of that. And what we should be looking at in terms of protecting our democracy against that sort of attack is a combination of things. It's about the transparency of the information that users see. I think it's about the responsibility of the companies to monitor what's going on their platform. I mean, there's been a huge focus on what has actually been a relatively small amount of activity, which was the Russians buying adverts to run on Facebook during the American election. Now, that's something that should have been picked up by the Facebook ad team, but wasn't at the time, and wasn't for another 18 months until they were eventually, the demands that they should go and look got louder and louder. So it's a combination of what new tools can be put in place to help users identify potential sources of disinformation, maybe to identify where information is being posted from or where pages are being run from, and also I think much greater scrutiny over the way advertising works and probably a higher bar for people who wish to use advertising to promote messages during elections. I mean, we've suggested in the UK that you should only be able to advertise on sites like Facebook during an election campaign, during the official short period of the campaign, if you are a registered campaigning organisation.
And Raisa, I mean, in a country like Sri Lanka, how effective is regulation? And sort of talk to us about what happened there recently, how the Facebook platform was used to spread violence, and what has been done to address that.
So, for those who don't know, in March this year, there were a series of violent riots which targeted the Muslim minority community. And this is not a new phenomenon. This kind of violence has been happening since as early as 2014 and even earlier, with the kind of emergence of these Buddhist groups. And it might seem like an oxymoron to call them extremist Buddhist groups, but that's what they are. They essentially kind of call for the promotion of Buddhism at the expense of minority communities. And as a result of this, this kind of violence, it was actually sparked off by a Facebook video, which was kind of streamed live, where somebody had found a lump of flour in their food. It later turned out to be flour, but was saying that it was a sterilization pill. This kind of stems from underlying insecurities which kind of are exacerbated by social media. So this resulted in riots, and in order to try and stem this problem, the government decided to shut down a number of social media platforms for 2 weeks. So Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp for the entire country. And as a result of that, the government has said that this method worked. But in fact, we found, and we were some of those who were monitoring the spread of hate speech, we found that that was not the case. And some of these hate groups were using things like VPNs and circumvention technologies to get online and to continue spreading hate speech.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and on the issue of hate speech and what constitutes hate speech, as you all look at this from a regulatory perspective, the platforms as well as governments, I mean, that is a situation where obviously people were inflamed to take violent action. But there are also other situations, such as, for example, as we were talking about a little bit earlier in the United States, certain Alec Jones was just bounced off of Twitter. So how are you all deciding? How do you decide what is the line between basically who should get shut down?
Well, I think we have to look seriously now at ending the blanket platform neutrality of the tech companies. To say where you've got harmful content, and we could be really clear and define content as illegal content. Most of this content, almost all of this content, would already be in breach of the community guidelines of the big tech platforms. Yet it's there. And I think it's reasonable to say to a company, if, say, you've got jihadi recruitment videos on Facebook or on YouTube, they've been identified, the company's been notified about them, they have a period of time to take them down, and if they haven't, then they have a liability for them being there. I think it's fair enough to push the companies further to say, what tools could you realistically introduced to actually not wait for user referral, but to identify this content for yourselves and have specifications for that. We've seen in Germany where the strict enforcement of hate speech laws in Germany onto Facebook and other social media companies has seen a much bigger investment in those companies in complying with those requirements and taking down that content. And I think there is an issue about who's posting this content in the first place. Where is it coming from? What do we do about that? But also to say that if the big platforms have become the preferred method of distribution, then they have a responsibility as well to be vigilant about how their tools are being used, and ultimately they have some liability towards that as well. I think that's certainly something that my committee recommended in its report, and something I think the UK government will speak about in the autumn when it publishes its internet safety strategy, which may look at establishing exactly these sorts of liabilities.
And is that, I mean, how easy is that for you all to do? And can you take down certain content within just the space of an hour? What other tools are you all using to kind of enable greater monitoring and to take action?
I mean, we are developing those tools, and I just want to describe, I think, the model that works and the model that doesn't work, because I think there's some confusion. I think the model that works is what we would call a co-regulatory model. So it is exactly where you have an agreed set of values that certain content must be removed for public order reasons, and actually your Article 10 rights to freedom of expression in Europe or Article 19 universally contains that whole concept that you must justify why it's necessary to interfere with freedom of expression, and the response must be proportionate. I think you can have a very good conversation in areas like terrorism, child safety, and so on, where there'll be nothing between us and the government, or most governments that respect human rights, that there's certain content that needs to be removed. That model, I think, has got a lot in it, and I think it is going to develop in a number of countries. So there is going to be this conversation between the government as the regulator and the accountable body, and the platforms as the sort of immediate regulators of content, because they're on the ground receiving the complaints. They have the power to scan for the content. That works. The one that doesn't work, that is also floated, is strict liability on platforms for all of the content shared through them from the moment it's shared. I just headline, I described earlier that the benefits that the platforms have brought to everyone is they've created very low barriers to entry. Strict liability will raise those barriers, and some people may say that's a price worth paying. I think we would argue it's not. I mean, if we get to the point where we have to edit your content and we have to sort of hold it up for legal checks before you can publish it, I'm not sure that is a necessary and proportionate response. So I think we should be doing everything we can to deal with the harmful content, but we shouldn't go to the point where we say, well, the answer now is to make the platforms the gatekeepers for everything that everybody wants to share online.
Well, would you agree with that? Or how problematic is that?
I think it's a complex question, and I also just wanted to kind of raise a response to something that was spoken about earlier about the German kind of regulation and about regulation and how it would work in societies like ours. So for instance, for Sri Lanka, in the past, we've kind of had a history where governments have kind of been repressive and kind of cracked down on freedom of expression through passing laws. For example, the Prevention of Terrorism Act has been used to detain journalists for the work that they've done. So whilst ideally I do kind of agree that there needs to be buy-in from the state and from regulators, but there also needs to be a recognition and protection of the freedom of expression and for the work of journalists in doing what they do. And kind of adding on to the question that you asked, which is like, do you think, if I'm not wrong, do you think putting the onus onto Facebook would work? Was that the question?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Was your question about whether putting the onus on social media platforms would work for our context?
Yes, yeah.
I think, again, it's a bit of a nuanced question, and it's difficult to talk about in terms of absolutes. First of all, we have to say that the issues that kind of resulted in violence kind of predate the use of social media. So there are kind of underlying tensions which also need to be addressed at the political level. There needs to be promotion and kind of recognition of tolerance and things like that. But having said that, you know, Facebook, I'm talking about Facebook not just because you are on the panel, but for Sri Lanka, there are 6 million Sri Lankans who use Facebook. It's the most widely used platform of social media. And for a lot of young people, it's how they access the news. So if you look at it from that way, I think it is important that there should be some recognition of how important the role that platforms like Facebook play, and how sometimes, as happened in March, the use of it by these groups can kind of lead to real-world harm.
We'll come back to the issue of news and fake news in a moment, but Damian,
I think what we're talking about is a limited liability for the tech companies on illegal content. So if content is there that's harmful, this could be, you know, child pornography, jihadi recruitment videos, the clearly most nasty, most unpleasant stuff that no one wants to see online. That when the company's been notified that it's on their platform, that it should come down within a tight period of time. There's also an interesting tool that the Home Office in the UK developed to demonstrate how you could use machine learning to identify jihadi recruitment videos on YouTube. And I think it's a fair question to push back to the tech companies to say, actually, if this is reasonably within your capability, why aren't you doing more? Why are you waiting for user referral? Why aren't you doing more to identify yourself? Now, in part they do, but not everything gets through. Not everything gets stopped, rather. There is this other thing, though, that not all harmful content is necessarily illegal. You know, cyberbullying is a big problem. I think we'd like to see the companies, you know, developing more tools to combat that, and potentially looking at how you take action against the most persistent offenders. And with disinformation and for fake news, again, I think we will soon be in a period where the level of sophistication of fakery and deep fake films of politicians giving speeches they never gave, becomes more of an issue during an election period. And are we to say then, well, you know, this is free speech, or are we to say this is an attempt to steal democracy, and therefore the companies with the technical power to try and intervene and stop this happening should use some of that power, when it can be, you know, beyond a shadow of a doubt proven that this content is fake?
Just to respond on the jihadi content, so we are, Damian will be pleased to hear, now removing, we believe, 99% of the Al-Qaeda and ISIS content before anyone's even seen it. So if we get a video, we can fingerprint it and we can remove all copies of that video. I deliberately said Al-Qaeda and ISIS because there is, again, pretty universal agreement and nobody is supporting them. Once you get into a lot of other stuff, actually, a lot of the most contentious content on social media is decidedly not illegal today. It's actually legal, but very offensive to people for one reason or another. And that's the area, actually, where, again, we could use some help, which is more clarity in the legal processes. Our criticism of the German law, for example, is that the German law tells us to decide what German law means. And we would much rather a German court decided what German law means and tells us than that we as the company. Well,
and that's a model that's being pursued in France by President Macron. So, can you talk about that a little bit? And how
Macron's false news law, we understand, is again, it's sort of sitting in front of the French Parliament. There may be French people here who are also close to it. But my understanding is that, that will be during the regulated election period. A French judge will give a takedown order. And there are actually models like this today. Brazil is going through its election now. Brazilian judges sit 24/7 during the election period. And they regularly, as we know as a company, issue orders ordering the takedown of content. Now, you can agree or disagree, but the key point is you actually have an order from a judge, someone in the state who's accountable, who's decided that that content shouldn't be up. And my understanding is that is the intention of the French government, which, you know, people may disagree with it, but it will be clear at least who issued the order. And if you're a citizen whose speech has been impacted, who you can go and complain to.
And Damian, talk also a little bit about the issue of enforcement. You've put a few proposals before your committee about, you know, how to basically keep, you know, the feet of companies like Facebook and Twitter to the fire. And tell us a little bit about what you've proposed and why you think those would be effective.
Yeah, I mean, there's a temptation because tech companies are always working at the cutting edge of what machines are capable of doing, that we always think of the companies as being young and new, but they're, on the whole, increasingly big and, let's say, middle-aged rather than old.
Like me. What do you say, Damian?
And therefore, most other sectors of the economy, be it, you know, broadcasting, financial services, telecommunications, which hold and process huge amounts of personal data, are regulated, and they're typically regulated in a way whereby governments create if you like, a schedule of requirements that they work to, and an independent body oversees them to see whether they're complying or not. And so I think what we're getting towards, I think, with the tech companies is a clearer understanding of saying, here are areas of, say, social harm, which we think are linked to social media. This is what we think the company should do about that. If they are found to be in breach of those standards, then here's action that could be taken against them. That could be fines, as in the case of Germany, or it could be something else. There is then the question about, if you like, liability in law. Could a citizen take a social media company, take legal action against a social media company because of a harm which has affected them or their family as a consequence of content that was there? I think where we're moving to is a position where more and more countries will start establishing these legal frameworks. There's then a question of who oversees it. You know, in the UK, do you have a body like Ofcom, who is the broadcast regulator? Should it be their responsibility to make sure the companies are complying with the law or not? We've already seen this in terms of data. In the UK, we have the Information Commissioner's Office, who is effectively the data protection policewoman in the case of Elizabeth Denham, and she's been given new powers under the Data Protection Act in the UK, which underpins all the GDPR protections that European citizens have, but also the power to go in and inspect companies as well, to go in and take data and information relevant to inquiries. So we're not constantly taking the word for tech companies that they're complying with the law. They have a regulator that can go in and see for themselves. There are obviously lots of good reasons why you can't publish the algorithms of social media companies. That would make the problems probably worse rather than better, but you need someone who's got the power to inspect.
And Raisa, let me come back to a point that you made just a few moments ago. Once again, back to the infamous, fake news issue. Obviously, sort of media around the world is having to face claims that they're providers of fake news, and yet, as you pointed out, Facebook is an important platform for people in your country to get news. Tell us a bit about how how are you all distinguishing what is a fake news story and what is real, and what if any role have the platforms sort of played in trying to address that?
So that's a good question. I mean, these kind of issues, I have to say, kind of have been occurring for long before they've become a kind of global conversation. We've been dealing with misinformation and this idea of fake news for a while now. So I would say, I think what Sanya said earlier about digital literacy is really important. So Sri Lanka has a high literacy rate. We have a 90% literacy rate. But when it comes to media literacy, we don't think critically. When somebody sends us something on WhatsApp, for instance, we'll often, especially if it's from a friend, we'll often forward it on. So how do we get people to stop and think before blindly sharing things? I think that's what we've also been trying to do. We've been trying to put out kind of infographics on verification, photo and video verification, for example, and trying to push people to think more critically. And when it comes to the role of platforms like Facebook, I guess people in the audience might know that Facebook actually announced they've rolled out this misinformation policy for Sri Lanka. Actually, I have to say that this was news to us because when it was rolled out, when the announcement came out, we hadn't actually heard about it, and it took a few weeks for us to kind of get up to speed because I have to also add that after the riots, we kind of put out this open letter, kind of talking to Facebook about the problems that they've had and how they haven't been taking down content relating to hate speech, calling for violence against women and discrimination. And following that, they actually did respond to us. And, so we've been kind of in communication with them. We've been learning more about the community standards and things like that. So this misinformation policy for Sri Lanka is kind of different to what's happening in the rest of the world. It basically says that content will be proactively removed if it can be shown to result in real-world harm. Now, this is a really progressive policy and a great step. But having said that, given how fast fake news can spread, for example, it's sometimes a matter of a couple of hours when things spread on Facebook and WhatsApp, and sometimes even faster. So how effective the new policy that's going to be in place is an open question, because it's still with kind of community partners. And while that's great, and it's great to have this kind of negotiation, we have kind of continually been asking for more support, language support, because when it comes to Sinhala and Tamil content, those are the two languages, the two national languages. A lot of content previously that was flagged wasn't taken down. And there are numerous examples of that. And so we continue to think that the most sustainable solution is improving language capacity. But having said that, we think that this policy is really going to be useful and progressive. And still a little early to say how successful it will be, but we think it will help.
So for you, the platform is the most effective actor. Let me have you all just respond to that in a second. But while they're doing that, please get your questions ready and raise your hand so that we can pass a microphone around.
Just briefly to say on, we agree totally on media literacy, and we're very much in the market for partners we can work with, because it's very local and context specific. Apologies if we didn't come back to you before the launch. I know that's been worked on for some time. Yeah. I suspect this may have something to do with the other constituency well represented here that keeps us on our toes, and that's investigative journalists who, and genuinely I mean that, they spend a lot of time looking into things, and they force us sometimes to accelerate something we had in our works, and that's a good thing. So I suspect we felt an urgency to get that policy change out there, because people were rightly scrutinizing what was going on. So apologies if sometimes that means we don't get back round to everyone, but the input was extremely valuable.
Do we have questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, Ian Walker from the New Democracy Foundation in Australia. My question's for all of you. I've appreciated your comments today, Raisa. I've heard so much about what the platform should be doing, but how much of it falls on people? Where is critical thinking in all this? And I see how much is levelled at the media, at platforms, and I'm curious for a comment on where does it fall on us as a citizen and an individual to look at something and think, hang on, I'd have to be an idiot to believe that.
Should people be turning one another in?
Yeah, well, I think, given we're in Greece, I was thinking earlier, what would Plato have made of Facebook? Would he thought it had been a good or bad thing? And
both.
Both. I was going to say both. But and the key thing that will be about the informed citizen. And the concern we have now is whether actually citizens are too easy. It's too easy to mislead people with false information, not just by creating the content and relentlessly targeting people with it when they're about to go out and vote, but also it's too easy to remove the things that we use in other media to weigh up what people say. So, in traditional media, we might know who that journalist is, who that news organization is, where they're based, what their values are, what they've written about before. We might use all of that to weigh it up. Often, the user does not have that sort of information when they're looking at news content on Facebook. That's how it's possible for someone in St. Petersburg to pretend they're a community action group in Texas, and without the tools for the user to know. So media literacy is important, but media literacy is only going to be valuable for the citizen if there are tools they can use which help them, which give them more information about what they're reading. So, I think on Facebook, for example, saying, identifying the, and I know this is something Facebook's been working on, identifying the country a page is being administered from, I think, is a really important tool. Maybe there could be other things like, is the page you're viewing, has the same phone number been used to set that page up as thousands of others? Is the person operating this page using a virtual private network to try and deliberately hide their location? Then you as a citizen could use that information to say, well, this looks to me like it could be fake, and therefore I'm going to downplay it, or I feel reassured that this is true. And I think we do need more of those tools.
I think we need to recognize the fact that I think many of the people who were critical consumers of news pre-social media are still critical consumers of news today. But what's happened is a whole new population of people who were not consuming news in any significant scale, who were not buying newspapers if they were available in their country, who were not consuming television news at any scale, are now consuming news through platforms like ours. And so that, I think, creates a responsibility sometimes for the first time. I mean, some of the stories actually in the region that Raisa comes from are kind of awful of somebody receiving something, a video, through a messaging service or an online platform and responding to it. Because, you know, that's in some cases the first time that, or these are the first few months in which anyone's ever sent them any kind of content like that, and they were completely shut out before. So it's kind of educating from first principles, I think, for a lot of people. And we've tried to play our part in that. We've done various things, issuing top tips, pushing out, you know, announcements about how to separate out news, but we're only in the foothills. But there's a huge amount more that I think we all need to do.
But I think there's an extra concern that in a situation like that, where someone starts being sent content of a political nature, and then the algorithm thinks it's interested in that, and you start getting served more and more of it, and you don't know, you've not made a conscious decision that should be the case. It's just happening. And we're moving into a world now where news is being consumed not in an edited or curated space, be it a website, by a newspaper or a news bulletin. It's being edited by an algorithm, you know, on a personal level for us. The algorithm is guessing what we're interested in, what we want to see. In the UK, if you have an Alexa speech device, you ask Alexa what the news is, because Amazon have done a deal with the BBC, it'll play you the most recent national radio news broadcast from Radio 4, BBC Radio 4. At some point in the future, though, if that deal didn't exist, Alexa might just play you something that it thinks, it'll play you the news it thinks you're interested in, and then how do you challenge people with inconvenient truths and things they don't know are important or they don't know they need to know?
It's the danger of the echo chamber effect. Other questions, please? Yes, the lady in back.
Hi, my name is Skylar, and I'm a student at Kenyon College in Ohio in the US. And the panel touched briefly on the issue of hate speech, and I'm wondering how you would define hate speech and determine what counts as hate speech, and if it ever has a place on social media platforms.
Richard, do you want to take that?
This is one of the hardest things we deal with. We have a definition, and the definition is essentially attacking categories of people who have protected characteristics in a kind of general way. But I just want to give you an example. We're hitting, at the moment, we've got some court cases in Germany, ironically, requiring us to restore content that we're deemed to be hate speech. And these are comments like, refugees are scum, refugees are scroungers, we should send them all back home. And there are people who will tell us very clearly that that is illegal and should come down, and there are people who will equally tell us that that's protected political speech and it should stay up. And this is the kind of area I say where we're doing our best. We've tried to be very clear. Our standards are published. You can go and, if you use a popular search engine and type in Facebook community standards, they will come up, and you can read exactly how we define it, who the categories are, what kind of language it is. But it's constantly moving because, I say, people's views on this are not settled. And we'll get people, I say, arguing on both sides about a particular piece of language. Very hard. But we show you what we try and do.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Elizabeth Anderson from the World Justice Project. We've been talking a lot about regulation, self-regulation of hate speech and fake news, but I'm wondering about anti-democratic regulation, and particularly for our Facebook representative, how do you navigate that terrain when governments are regulating your platform or the users of your platform and working with you to essentially surveil that speech? And what are your rules for navigating that as a company, and thinking of the business of business? To what extent is your business, is there room for you in your business to push back on that kind of regulation?
That's a complicated question. Maybe you could give a Twitter version
I'll give
answer.
a Twitter version. Again, I think international human rights standards are the right way to approach this. We're signed up to them. And so it is that simple test. When a government is requiring us to do something, we will ask, just as they should do, is this necessary and proportionate? And I think for anything like child abuse material, terrorism, the answer will come back generally yes. If it's the Prime Minister is an idiot and we should vote them out of the office, the answer is going to come back no. And then there's a bunch of stuff in between. For example, some of the hate speech that causes violence within communities may not be obvious, But if you can show a link between that speech and the violence, you've passed the necessary and proportionate test, I think. Those are the words I would keep in mind. If a government goes outside of that framework, we have a backwards and forwards. We try and resist a request that falls outside that framework.
Time for another, sorry, quick question before we have to. Yes, this lady. Actually, who has the microphone? Okay. Farah, and then one more quickly.
Hello. Farah Nayeri, I write for the New York Times. I had a question for you, Richard. The Cambridge Analytica scandal recently raised serious issues of trust in Facebook and what Facebook did with the data that it got. And Facebook does offer its platform for free, but there is a trade-off in that. And I was just wondering, why should the world trust you when you say that you are taking down all of the jihadi, Daesh, ISIS, Al-Qaeda stuff, and that you are, stopping hackers in the middle of Central Asia from putting up stuff that will affect elections in the West?
Yeah. It's Greece, but if I'm allowed to slip into Latin, I think the question you're asking is quis custodiet custodes, who watches the watchers, which is a really important question. I think that's the one we've realized that we've admitted that we made mistakes. We weren't particularly focused enough on various vectors of attack, and so trust has been damaged. And so if you listen to the language we're using, and the language reflects how we're thinking, we recognize that there is a need for us to be accountable externally. Some of that's our own transparency, that we will put stuff out there. Some of it is forced transparency, that people like Damian and his committee or journalists or others will be pushing us very hard. We agree with that. I mean, we think it is needed in order for people to have trust. They need us to say we're doing the right things and show them, but they do also need other people to test that proposition and either verify that we are doing the right things or find faults and play the faults back to us. And that's the place we are right now.
But the reason why this forced transparency has become so important is that I would contend that if it wasn't for the work of the New York Times and the Guardian newspaper and Chris Wiley coming forward, we would know nothing about the Cambridge Analytica data breach. Facebook knew about this, we know, in December 2015. The company have acknowledged that after an article in the Guardian. There was nothing was done in terms of really investigating it, identifying what the scale of the data breach was being, notifying users. That only happened because a whistleblower came forward who laid it all out, what had happened, and then Facebook had to address it. There are many concerns people have about, well, was this a one-off, or was this just a small example of what people were doing on the platform at the time? Former Facebook employees have said to my committee during our inquiry, it was well known 6 or 7 years ago that there were concerns within the company about how easy it was for developers to acquire Facebook user data and the relatively limited power the company had to do very much about that. And I think we've got these disclosures now because the company's been forced into doing it. I think there should be more transparency over the internal investigation Facebook is running about which other apps are under investigation, how many other users' accounts could have been breached in the way the Cambridge Analytica gathered this sort of data. And it's not good enough for us to get things piecemeal when Facebook feels like telling us. And that's why this breach of trust has occurred. And I don't think this will be repaired until the company does more to voluntarily submit itself to scrutiny and bring more of this information out to the public domain. Because both with this and again, Facebook was very reluctant to look for Russian ads on Facebook. It took multiple requests from the Senate Intelligence Committee to do that. When we first asked for similar studies to be done on the UK in regards to Brexit, the company flat refused to do it. And that's why this failure of trust has occurred.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, and there's obviously plenty more questions. There is a Facebook lounge for those of you who'd like to go quiz Richard for the rest of the afternoon on this. But, that's a really pertinent point to end this discussion on. I would just add that, there was a big article that just came out in the New Yorker magazine about Mark Zuckerberg and, the big monster that Facebook has become. The final question that is posed, or the that is posited is, you know, Mark Zuckerberg has made Facebook great. Can he make it good? So that remains to be seen. Thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us. And let me welcome Kyle Bozenko up to the stage.
All right. Thank you, everybody. My name is Kyle Bozenko, and I am the Executive Director of the Jefferson Center. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our work. We are a civic engagement organization based out of St. Paul, Minnesota. And at our domestic and global programming and partnerships are built on the concept of deliberative democracy. The notion that everyday people, citizens, community members, and residents everywhere, and especially those who may not have the time or privilege to dedicate their lives to become educated about or advocate on behalf of the issues that impact them, that these people do in fact have the wisdom, creativity, and insight to develop solutions to complex policy issues and challenges that affect their lives. Our founder, Ned Crosby, created a model known as the Citizens Jury in the mid-1970s, and since then, this model has been adapted and adopted in a multitude of global applications. This is not simply voting or posting political takes on Facebook. This is bringing people together to address the shortcomings of the policies and ideas they support, while also acknowledging the common values and the merits of things with which they disagree. Right now, this method is being used to rebuild trust in media in Ohio, to respond to local impacts of climate change in rural communities throughout Minnesota. We're looking at data governance issues in the US, as well as sustainable infrastructure in Canada and artificial intelligence in the future in the UK. Practitioners in Ireland have recently used these methods to surface the need for reforming the Irish Constitution and reconsidering abortion access. In the UK and Northern Ireland, colleagues at Involve UK and the RSA have been tackling social care funding schemes and economic reform, while in South Korea and South Australia, these methods have been used to evaluate involvement in nuclear energy in the future, as well as future involvement in the nuclear fuel cycle, along with other public programs. As you can glean from this overview, we don't like making this work easy on ourselves, but we do believe that these methods provide a framework for people to become actively and meaningfully involved in policy development and decision making. This afternoon, we will drastically condense this process for you with the goal that those of us gathered here will be able to collaboratively generate concrete, creative, and actionable solutions to strengthen and advance democracy. We've partnered with the New York Times for this year's Athens Democracy Forum because we're confident that if everyday people the world over can use these methods to tackle challenges put before them, you too will be able to develop an inspiring and aspirational set of ideas and solutions for strengthening democracy this afternoon. When you registered, you indicated a preference for a workshop topic, and when we dismiss you, we will have you walk out the back of the room and look for New York Times ADF staff with iPads who will let you know which topic you were registered for and which room to go in. Once you get there, our facilitators will draw on the firm moderating technique that Stephen Erlanger displayed this morning to walk you through this process step by step and have you arrive at outcomes and have you on your way to enjoying the rest of the evening and activities at our scheduled time. So with that, I would ask you all to please depart through the back of the room and find someone to direct you to the room you're at. Responsibility of business will be in room 3. Rule of law will be in room 11 and 12. Role of technology will be in room 13. Identity, diversity, and inclusion will be in room 15. Thank you.